The Life of Saint Theophan, the Recluse. Most people of the present era devote themselves to a ceaseless round of external activities. The world has undergone such a revolution since World War II that everyone now runs after money and power. The struggle to obtain these precious commodities absorbs all our time and our energy. Everything has been reduced to money. Nothing else seems to have value. Art is valued, not for its beauty, but for the high prices it commands. Integrity and character are not valued at all. As the horror and emptiness of the primary values of our era reveal themselves ever more clearly, a contrasting pool of light is more and more sharply delineated. In this light stand those great souls who have ordered their lives around a different set of values. These are people who have disengaged from the outer world in order to plunge more fully into the inner world. These are intrepid explorers of the soul, those whom we call saints. They do not trumpet their activities to the world. Rather, they manifest an extraordinary love which heals the wounds of those lost in pursuit of the world's values. By their lives and their teaching, they direct those who are overcome by the emptiness of the outer life into the living depths of love. Saint Theophan the Recluse belongs to this group of deeply spiritual persons. Bishop Theophan, known in the secular world as George Govorov, was born on January 10, 1815, in the village of Chernaskoye in the province of Oryol. His father Basil was a priest of the parish church in that village. At the age of 8, George entered the ecclesiastical school in Livny, and at 14 he was promoted to Oryol Theological Seminary. Having finished seminary in 1837 with excellent marks, George received an appointment to study at the Kiev Theological Academy. Kiev was the birthplace of Christianity in Russia, and also the birthplace of Russian monasticism. A community of monks had been established in the caves near Kiev from the first days of Christianity in Russia. This monastery has been in existence since those early days, broken only during the Soviet period. George was greatly influenced by the monks of the Kiev caves Lavra. In this place, the ancient spiritual traditions were kept alive. Here, there were true witnesses who participated fully in the ancient traditions of heroic spiritual exploits. As a young student, George often went to the Kiev caves Lavra. He experienced extraordinary manifestations of God's grace in that place. These spiritual experiences were so deep and so powerful that even at the end of his life, he remembered them with delight. Kiev Lavra is an unearthly, heavenly abode. During this time, his spiritual father was a monk of the Lavra, schema monk Partheny of Kiev. Partheny was widely recognized as one of the true spiritual elders of his time. His influence on the young, impressionable student must have been powerful. In the last year of his studies at the academy, at the age of 25, George made up his mind to devote himself to God by serving the church as a monk. He was tonsured a monk on February 15, 1841, with the name of Theophan, in honor of Saint Theophan the Confessor of Sigrion. In April 1841, the monk Theophan was ordained a hierodeacon in the main Dormition Cathedral of Kiev Caves Lavra, and on July 1st of the same year he was ordained a hieromonk. Continuing his studies at the academy, he graduated in 1841 with a master's degree in theology. Immediately upon his graduation, on August 27, 1841, hieromonk Theophan was appointed headmaster of an ecclesiastical school, and shortly thereafter, as the inspector of Novgorod Theological Seminary, a position of considerable responsibility. By the age of 29, he was promoted to the St. Petersburg Theological Academy and was assigned to the faculty of the Department of Moral and Pastoral Theology. This was the foremost theological institution in the Russian Empire at that time. From this quick rise, it is clear that Theophan's abilities were highly regarded by the church authorities. About his understanding of how to prepare for the responsibilities of an educator, Theophan writes, quote, "An educator should experience all the stages of Christian perfection in order to know in his subsequent activity how to behave and be able to notice the inclinations of his pupils, and then to influence them with patience, successfully, strongly, and fruitfully. Such educators should be a class of the purest, chosen by God, and saintly persons." Unquote. Thus, we see that in his pedagogical activity the young theologian did not use the speculative methods or rely solely on books. Rather, he based his teaching on the Christian ascetic and psychological experience, which he recapitulated in his own person. Hieromonk Theophan was not greatly pleased by the administrative duties of his office. He had a profound distaste for such work, and in his heart of hearts was not satisfied with this service. Quote, "The duties of my office fill me with nausea and distract me from church. The true paradise is there. When I come to the church, I have the feeling that this is the place to remain forever." Unquote. Such were the longings in this young man's heart for God, and God alone. An opportunity for satisfying his spiritual needs soon arose for Hieromonk Theophan. On August 21st, 1847, in accordance with his desire, he was appointed a member of the Russian ecclesiastical mission to Jerusalem. He left Russia and sojourned in the Holy Land for the next 6 years. The purpose of this mission was to investigate the state of orthodoxy in the Middle East and to establish a permanent Russian ecclesiastical presence there. Based in Jerusalem, members of this mission traveled throughout the area, especially to Syria, Egypt, Sinai, and Mount Athos. The 6-year sojourn in the East had great spiritual importance for Hieromonk Theophan. During this time, he visited the ancient monasteries of the Holy Land, where he studied the manuscripts of the early church fathers. Much of his work was done in the library of St. Sabas Monastery in Palestine and St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. He acquainted himself with the order and regulations of the Palestinian monasteries and with the lives of the great ascetics who had dwelt there. In addition, the young ascetic Theophan established close spiritual relationships with the elders of Athos by correspondence. They had a beneficial influence on the direction of his spiritual life and later helped him publish his works. During these 6 years, Hieromonk Theophan learned Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and French. All of this occurred in conjunction with his other considerable duties. His scholarly efforts here were to bear fruit later, during the period of his seclusion. Georges Florovsky, with his uncanny eye for discerning what is truly important, writes about Theophan's participation in the following way. Quote, "The journey to the East proved to be a major event in Theophan's life, extending his ecclesiastical horizons and endowing his worldview with an ecumenical courage, a great spiritual freedom, and suppleness, a freedom from cultural context." Unquote. This mission came to an end with the eruption of the Crimean War in 1853, and in 1854 all the members of the mission were recalled from Jerusalem to Russia. On the way home, the delegation spent considerable time in Italy and Germany, so Theophan became acquainted firsthand with the Church in the West. For his service on the mission, Hieromonk Theophan was raised to the rank of archimandrite on April 4, 1855. He was quickly appointed as a lecturer in canon law at St. Petersburg Theological Academy, and 6 months later as the rector of Aulnay Theological Seminary. On June 13, 1857, by the decree of the Most Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, Archimandrite Theophan was appointed as rector of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. Thus, at 42 years of age, Theophan became the most important theological educator in the Russian Empire. A scant 2 years later, in 1859, the church authorities decided to raise Archimandrite Theophan to the rank of bishop for the dioceses of Tambov and Shatsk. Bishop Theophan served only 4 years in the Tambov diocese. But in the course of such a short period, he proved to be a zealous minister in all spheres of church life. During one of his pastoral journeys in the diocese, Bishop Theophan came to the hermitage at Visha and greatly liked it for its order and regulations, for its location, which was very suitable for the solitary life, and for its beautiful surroundings. Quote, "There is nothing better in the whole world than Visha," unquote, he wrote later. Sometime later, when appointing Igumen Arkady to be Father Superior of Visha, Theophan at parting told him prophetically, quote, "Go there, Father Igumen, and then, God willing, I will come to you," unquote. When he was 46, Theophan was among those official church representatives who were present at the opening of the holy relics of Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk and his subsequent canonization. The body of Saint Tikhon was exhumed and his coffin opened. Those present witnessed that Tikhon's relics were preserved by the Holy Spirit without corruption. This experience profoundly moved Theophan and shaped the rest of his life. Barely 5 years later, he, like Bishop Tikhon before him, retired from public life and went into seclusion to serve God with even more intensity. On July 22, 1863, Bishop Theophan was transferred to the ancient and much larger diocese of Vladimir and Suzdal. In the report of the Holy Synod, it was written that Theophan, quote, "by his present ministry, has acquired the necessary experience to rule so numerous a flock," unquote. Bishop Theophan was an excellent preacher and did much to improve the standards among the clergy of his diocese. Unlike many prelates, he lived very simply. He dressed plainly and ate only one meal a day. Concerned for education, he founded a school for girls and many parish schools. He tried in everything to teach his people the way leading to salvation. But the vast practical activities of ruling a diocese were not dear to Theophan's heart. From his youth, he had longed for solitude. He remembered later, quote, "From my youngest days I sought after and prayed that no one would prevent me from being with God constantly," unquote. And now, after 25 years of serving the Church through different posts and activities, Bishop Theophan found it opportune to realize his constant yearning. Having asked advice of Metropolitan Isidore of St. Petersburg, his old spiritual guide from his days at the Oryol Theological Academy, he petitioned the Holy Synod for retirement with the light to live in Visha Hermitage and the Tambov Diocese. The Holy Synod granted his petition, and on July 17, 1866, he was released from his duties as diocesan bishop and appointed Father Superior of Visha Hermitage. When Bishop Theophan arrived in Visha at the age of 51, he found a large and vigorous monastery with about 100 monks. The outward conditions at Visha were quite suitable for the spiritual needs of the ascetic Theophan. Visha Hermitage was situated far from large and noisy towns in a beautiful forest at the confluence of two rivers, the Tsina and the Visha. The monastery followed the Cenobitic system, and its regulations and customs were distinguished by their austerity and strictness. "It is so quiet at our monastery," wrote Bishop Theophan, "that it is worthy of astonishment." To the end of his life, the bishop felt quite happy in Visha. Quote, "One may exchange Visha only for the kingdom of heaven," unquote. The position of superior of the monastery, however, disturbed Theophan's peace. Thus, shortly after his arrival at Visha, he petitioned the Holy Synod again, this time for release from this position. The Synod granted this petition. The long-awaited solitude Bishop Theophan had desired so persistently came at last. Shortly thereafter, Theophan drew up a program for his work, including the translation of important works from the Greek Fathers and his own writing. He did not seclude himself from society during his first 6 years in the monastery. He willingly received visitors who came for his spiritual advice and instruction, went for walks, and sometimes, although very seldom, departed from the monastery for short periods. Prayer was his main occupation during these first years at the monastery. He kept firmly in mind the precept of his spiritual father, Schema monk Partheni of Kiev, that, quote, one thing is the most important and necessary, namely to pray, and to pray to God constantly with all one's mind and heart, unquote. With the monks of the monastery, he regularly attended all the services, and on Sundays and feast days, he celebrated the Divine Liturgy together with the brethren. He participated fully in the church services, and often stood without moving and with his eyes closed, so as not to be distracted from the prayer of his heart. Before his seclusion, Theophan occasionally became totally immersed in prayer. During services, after he had received communion, the Antiteron would be brought to him. Theophan would be standing so totally immersed in prayer that it would be several minutes before he became aware that someone was waiting for him. At the beginning of his sojourn in Visha, it was difficult to leave the world completely, and there were temptations to return. It is reported that Theophan was offered the position of Metropolitan, one of the ruling bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church. But these were transient temptations for Theophan, and he put them aside to concentrate on his work of spiritual direction, writing, and translation. However rigorously Theophan limited his intercourse with the world, nevertheless it distracted his attention from the main purposes for which he had come to Visha. As a result, he began to think about complete seclusion. This, however, was not realized all at once, but only gradually. First, Theophan spent the whole of one great Lent in absolute seclusion, and this experiment was successful. Then, he secluded himself for an entire year. This provided him with the tranquility necessary to continue and deepen his work. And so Bishop Theophan came to the stillness he had desired so persistently throughout his life. In 1872, after the days of Easter, Bishop Theophan distributed his belongings to the poor and began the life of a recluse. He broke off all personal contact with people and ceased attending the divine services with the brethren. From 1872 to the end of his life, he received only the Father Superior of the monastery, Archimandrite Arkady, his spiritual father, Igumen Tikhon, and his cell assistant, Father Evlampy. With all the others who longed to receive his spiritual guidance, he continued his conversations by means of correspondence only. In Theophan's understanding, seclusion was for the purpose of unceasing prayer. What is seclusion for? Wrote Theophan. It is when the mind, having enclosed itself in the heart, stands before God with veneration and does not want to go out of the heart or concern itself with anything else. Theophan's prayer labor revolved around the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. Bishop Theophan had established a chapel in his rooms and consecrated it in honor of the Epiphany. In this cell church he celebrated the Divine Liturgy on Sundays and on the feast days. During the last 11 years of his life, he celebrated the liturgy every day. He always performed the service alone, usually in silence, but at times chanting aloud. The monks of the monastery were of the opinion that Bishop Theophan performed the liturgy according to the rule of the hermits of Palestine and Mount Athos, which was familiar to him from his experience as a member of the mission in Jerusalem. During the day, at the proper times, he chanted the rest of the monastic services, vespers, midnight service, matins, and hours. When he could not conduct the services, he replaced them with the Jesus prayer. Bishop Theophan was constantly in meditation and prompted others to do the same. "Don't deviate from God in your mind," he wrote in one of his letters, "whether you are praying or doing something else." Theophan kept himself in a state of constant, uninterrupted meditation, mainly by reading the Holy Scriptures and books of the Church Fathers. In his cell, he had one of the largest private libraries in Russia. There were books from all branches of human knowledge in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, German, French, English, and other languages. Bishop Theophan's literary activities were truly heroic. Second only to his prayer life, Theophan devoted himself to an extended ministry to the Church by means of his writing and correspondence. According to his own acknowledgement, not infrequently he spent day and night in this work. In addition, Theophan struggled with cataracts in both eyes in his later years. Twice he left Visha for treatment for these cataracts, but without result. At the age of 73, he became blind in one eye, but continued his work. Bishop Theophan saw his seclusion as an opportunity to minister to the wider church through his writings. The silence and ordered life that he created for himself in seclusion served to assist him as he penetrated more and more deeply into the mysteries of prayer and the spiritual life. This sacrifice of himself enabled him to draw closer to God than was possible amidst the distractions of service in the world. We are blessed even today to receive the continuing fruits of his ascetic and literary labors. Theophan's literary efforts can be grouped into three main areas. First, he continued to direct spiritual seekers by means of a voluminous correspondence. Quote, "For very many people he became a correspondent confessor." Unquote. He received 20 to 40 letters every day and answered them all faithfully. This by itself would be an extraordinary feat. His correspondence has been gathered together and partially published. The most important collections of his letters have been published under the titles The Spiritual Life and How to Be Attuned to It, and Letters on the Christian Life. Adapted from his correspondence with Princess P.S. Lukomskaya. Second, and in addition to his prodigious correspondence, Theophan translated into Russian books that he thought might be edifying for his countrymen. These included 5 volumes of the Philokalia, Ancient Monastic Statutes, Unseen Warfare, and the Sermons of St. Simeon the New Theologian. The Philokalia alone took 20 years to translate completely. Finally, Theophan wrote books of his own. The volume on repentance which you are now holding is taken from his major work, The Path of Salvation. His other works, which have not been translated, include On Prayer and Vigilance, On Penance, Communion, and Reformation of Life, and commentaries on all of the epistles of St. Paul, with the exception of the letter to the Hebrews, and on several of the Psalms. In English, there is an excellent book, The Art of Prayer, which is compiled mostly from the works of Theophan. The principal theme of Theophan's writings was salvation in Christ. The works of the Eastern Church Fathers and ascetics were the foundation for his understanding in these matters. His writings were both comprehensive in their completeness and faithful in their reflection of the spirit and nature of the ascetic views of the Fathers. Bishop Theophan was widely acknowledged as, quote, "a genuine and typical continuer of patristic tradition in asceticism and theology," unquote. The works of the Recluse of Visha are not the fruit of a theoretical or speculative theologian, but the experience of an active ascetic who built his spiritual life on the rock of the Holy Scriptures and holy traditions of the Church. "We know," wrote Professor A. Bruzov, "not a single theologian would be penetrated with biblical and patristic spirit to such an extent as that which is so obvious in every line of Bishop Theophan. One can say with certainty that all his moral teaching is biblical and patristic, and in this is his greatest merit." Theophan alternated his prayer and writing with different kinds of handiwork, according to the custom of the Desert Fathers. It refreshed him, and above all, it banished any thoughts of idleness. The bishop occupied himself with painting, wood carving, lath work, and bookbinding. For these occupations there were several boxes with the necessary tools in his study. Besides that, there were a telescope, 2 microscopes, a camera, an anatomical atlas, and 6 atlases of geography and history in his cell. Theophan especially liked icon painting. After his death, there were found in his cell many icons and pictures of sacred history that he had painted. While in seclusion, Theophan decided to learn how to play musical instruments. For this purpose, he ordered a harmonium and then a violin, together with self-instruction manuals and sheet music for different spiritual compositions. Although Theophan secluded himself from society, he did not lose interest in national and international events. He willingly responded to the most significant events in the public life of his native land. He was sharply critical of the moral and spiritual decline which he saw throughout Russia. He constantly exhorted the hierarchs and clergy to reform before true orthodoxy was lost. In this way, he seemed to see prophetically into the future and to have some foreknowledge of the events coming to Russia in 1917 and following. Theophan was widely recognized in his own day. The Church throughout Russia felt and appreciated his efforts through his literary output, despite his reclusion and isolation in the forests of Visha. He continued to receive honors and acclaim. Over the course of his life in reclusion, he was elected as an honorary member of all of the theological academies of the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1890, 4 years before his death, the St. Petersburg Academy awarded him an honorary doctorate of divinity. Bishop Theophan was remarkably healthy until his end. 5 days before his death, there were changes in his schedule. Professor P.A. Smirnov described Theophan's last days. On the eve of his death, January 5th, his lordship, feeling weak, asked for help to walk. The Kelanik assisted Bishop Theophan for a few turns around the room. But his lordship, quickly becoming tired, sent the Kelanik away and went to bed. On the day of Theophan's death, the Kelanik, hearing no accustomed knock, looked into the study of the bishop at 1 p.m. The bishop was sitting and writing something. After half an hour, there was a slight knock. During the meal, the bishop consumed half of an egg and drank half of the glass of milk. Hearing no knock for tea, the Kelanik looked in at 4:30 p.m. The bishop was lying in bed, dead. His left hand rested on his breast, while the right was formed as for the episcopal blessing. When the bishop was pontifically vested, a smile clearly appeared on his face. Bishop Theophan died in peace on the feast day of the Theophany, January 6th, or 19th, in 1894. His body was placed in his cell chapel for 3 days. Then, for another 3 days, it was placed in the cathedral. During this time, there was no smell of corruption. A great crowd of people from all over Russia came for his funeral. We know very little of Theophan's life in reclusion. It is often the case that the world learns of the ascetic feats of a holy one like Theophan by means of the reports of the cell attendant after the death of the ascetic. We do not have this in Theophan's case. His cell attendant of 25 years, Father Evlampi, fasted for 10 days after the bishop's death and died within 2 weeks of Theophan's passing. It was as if he could not bear to remain on earth without the sweetness of the Blessed One whom he had served. In accordance with his will, all of St. Theophan's manuscripts were sent to the library at the monastery of St. Panteleimon on Mount Athos. Given the events which befell Russia subsequently, this foresight was blessed. Unfortunately, at the present time, these manuscripts are deteriorating due to the poor conditions in the monastery library. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the monastery at Visha was closed in 1924, and the monks were exiled to an unknown fate. The monastery buildings were later turned into a mental hospital by the communists. Theophan's relics were moved to a nearby village church, where they remain to this day. In 1988, the Russian Orthodox Church convened a council for the whole church in Russia to celebrate the millennium of Christianity in their country. At this celebration, which took place on June 6 through 9th, 1988, the Russian Church formally recognized the sanctity of Bishop Theophan, and he was canonized. Known now as Saint Theophan the Recluse, he is with us still to guide us along that great way which leads to our salvation. Pray for us, Holy Father Theophan, who still journey on the way.